If you look at the debate over American foreign policy in these years, you find that it has some very interesting properties. Until the late 60s, when the pressure of the student movement sort of compelled the universities and the journals and so on to at least pay a little bit of attention to some critical scholarship. Until that time, it's quite fair to say, I think, that American scholarship with regard to foreign affairs oscillated, fell somewhere on a spectrum that was defined between two extremes. At the one extreme, you have what is sometimes called the orthodox version, as presented by people like Herbert Feiss or, well, essentially Arthur Schlesinger and others like that, which essentially gives, you might say, the government version of events, presents the state religion. At the other extreme, you had the critics, who were often called the realist critics, people like George Kennan and Hans Morgenthau. And if you look at the debate that took place between the orthodox theorists and the critics, you discover something rather interesting about the way in which a system of propaganda and indoctrination functions. The orthodox critics held, very much as Schlesinger in that comment that I mentioned, that the United States is unique among the nations of the world and modern history, or maybe any history, in that it really has no foreign policy. It sort of blunders about in the world, reacting to what other people do, guided by kind of an abstract moralism, benevolence, concern for Wilsonian principles of freedom and self-determination and so on. That these are, for some reason, the United States does it too naive and simplistic to really have any concept of material interest, so we just kind of, basically react or defend ourselves or something of that kind. That's the orthodox view. Now, the critical view, the view of the critics of this, is very revealing and interesting. It's always much more interesting in studying a propaganda system to look at the critics, that is, the ones who are tolerated, the tolerated critics. What the critics say is, yes, it is true that the United States is unique among the nations of history in this lack of policy and commitment to abstract moral principles, but this is bad, because what we ought to do is have a more committed understanding of the national interest and pursue that. And so the debate rages between these two polarized extremes, all of whom, of course, accept the same tacit and fundamental premise that the United States is unique among the nations of past and present history, etc., etc. Now, as I said, the work of the realist critics is the work that certainly gives you the deepest insight into how the system functions. And to get an idea, what I'd suggest is, if those are interested, to take a look, for example, at some of the work that was coming out in the early 60s. That's an interesting period, because that's a moment when the intelligentsia got what they thought was their shot at power. Kennedy seemed to be inclined to bring some of the Eastern liberal intellectuals into at least rubbing shoulders with people who made big decisions and so on. And that led to a feeling of euphoria on the campuses and in intellectual circles, and an interesting outpouring of literature, which is worth looking at. And again, I think maybe the most interesting work is, say, perhaps that of Hans Morgenthau, who's a very interesting figure, for one thing because he is a very serious political analyst, and furthermore because only a few years after this, in fact, he was so close to the limits of what is tolerated as, legitimate critical analysis, and therefore he's an interesting figure to look at when you and he's also sort of, the grand figure of American political science and hard-headed political analysis and so on. He has a book that came out, I think in 1961 or 62, about then, called The Purpose of America. And that's very interesting reading. He describes in there what he calls the transcendent purpose of the United States. And he says the United States is different from other countries in that other nations, other states, developed their purpose after they came into existence. But in the case of the United States, its purpose actually preceded its existence. That is, the United States came into existence to realize an already existing purpose. That's why he calls it a transcendent purpose. And that purpose was the search for equality and freedom for ourselves and for the world. And he says that American policy since that time has been guided by this transcendent purpose, what he calls the national purpose. Well, he's a historian, and he then goes on to look at the historical record, and he says, well, you look at the historical record, you find some funny things. Slavery, for instance, for a century, and, degradation of ethnic minorities since. You find intervention in Central America, but he says these were just isolated forays of no significance. And then the intervention in the Philippines, but again, that was just sort of a random event. We forget about that, statistical error and so on. And he goes on to describe these things, and he says, many critics who have looked at this historical record have concluded that all of this talk about national purpose and our commitment to Wilsonian ideals and so on is just rhetoric intended to disguise what's really going on. And he says, those critics, you can sort of understand them, but he says they're committing a fundamental error of logic. And the error of logic is this, I'm quoting, they're confusing reality with the abuse of reality. Now, you have to get this. Reality is what is the national purpose as it was intended. The abuse of reality is what actually happened. See? And then he says, this is really there. I'm not making it up. If you don't believe me, look at it. He then goes on to say that they're committing what he calls the error of atheism, which has criticized religion on similar grounds. And that's a very astute comment. In fact, we should also draw the further conclusion that, in fact, what he and a good deal of academic scholarship is presenting is a kind of religion, the state religion, we might call it. That is a set of beliefs that you're just supposed to have if you want to be a civilized and well-behaved person with a good shot at a job and that sort of thing. And in fact, it is committing the error of atheism to raise, to mix up what really happened with the religious doctrine to which we are about that to which we are actually committed.